From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. Benjamin Williams, thank you so much for being here today. You are currently an undergraduate student at Columbia studying French and Francophone Studies, as well as German literature and cultural history. You're also a member of the Language Resource Center staff. You're a student assistant here at the Language Resource Center. And as you describe it, or have described it to me, a enthusiastic student of languages. So I wanted to start out by asking you a little bit about some of the languages that you've studied. What have you studied? How long have you studied them? And how would you characterize your current proficiency in these languages?
All right. I was born and raised in an almost entirely monolingual household. The closest thing was that my mother had taken French in high school and studied a little in college. But so my mother tongue is English. I have spoken it for all 20 years of my existence. And it wasn't until I was 12 that I began to learn French. I was interested because my sister, who was 2 years older than me, had started taking French, and it had been a year into that. And I was so fascinated by it that I had started learning on my own before we were officially enrolled in courses for French. And then I studied French in classes from the age of 13 to the present day, but I studied it all throughout middle school and high school. And then once I got to university, I made an interesting choice, I'll say, as I've characterized it, and spent my first semester in 4 different languages. I had classes in English, I had a higher level course in French, and then I began at the elementary level with German and ancient Greek.
Whoa.
The funny story about ancient Greek is I was a big fan of Percy Jackson. My sister was an even bigger fan, but I was a big fan of Percy Jackson, the young adult novel series. And so it has much to do with Greek mythology and Greek history. And sometimes there are words that are in ancient Greek, like the name of the sword that Percy wields, Anaklusmos, which means riptide. And I found that fascinating. And I said, I want to do ancient Greek. And I was like, I don't want to take a lot of time to like meander around. I want to get into the weeds. And I had emailed the instructor, a wonderful grad student here, and I had asked, I am a first semester freshman. Is this realistic to take this class? And she very politely said, I do not recommend it, but you can. Did it anyways. Came out scarred for life. Maybe not scarred for life, but definitely kind of turned off the path of being a classicist. Had a very opposite experience with German, had a very wonderful grad student teach that, and became so enamored with it that I continued with German throughout the year. I was awarded a scholarship to study in Berlin in a semi-intensive language course, and then continued on to this day where I'm now at the advanced level. And I also, beginning last year, began to learn Italian with an intensive elementary course. And I'm now Italian's a little on the back burner. It's not a language that I'm really focused on improving, getting into like a near native level, but I still engage with it on a regular basis. I still find much joy in speaking it. And as to your question about how I would characterize my level, I always find that so difficult. English, I am a native speaker. French and German, I'd say, are about at, using like European framework, B2, B2C1. It's a kind of nebulous zone for me because sometimes I feel very comfortable like expressing complex ideas in an academic sense, but struggle with everyday objects that I don't use or am not familiar with or don't remember because I don't need to interact with them. And ancient Greek, some reading knowledge, and I do actually use it for like etymological reasons. German has a lot of ancient Greek words, or
Yeah,
words
yeah.
of Greek origin. And then Italian, I'd say B1, B1 point, or B1 and a half.
So, one thing that you said that really interested me is that you've been studying French since you were 12, but you've been studying German since you were around 18. Is that right?
Yes, I was 18 when I started German.
However, you said that you felt you were at the same level with both of these languages. So, how would you characterize the difference between learning a language starting at age 12 and learning a language starting at age 18? How does that kind of feel different for you? And also, why do you think that your German was able to get up to the same level as your French in such a reduced period of time?
Right. Well, there are a few things. On the one part, I think in general, I was 12 when I started French, and so I was very you are just beginning at that kind of age developmentally to form more complex thought ideas or be able to tackle bigger issues. You're not quite there. You can understand many things, but you're just at a different developmental stage than you are at 18. And I found that, well, and then this is where the kind of me part of it comes in. I always felt kind of like we were slogging behind in my French class. Like I could have gone faster, or like I was ready for more complex things. And I found that when I was at university and I was learning German, I was picking up everything very quickly. I was able to use my years of learning strategies as well as things I learned from Greek. Learning Greek at the same time helped me. I claim this to this day. It helped me so much with really picking up German super quickly. And I think another thing was motivation. Of course, motivation is extremely important, if not one of the most important things in language learning. When I got to university, I made a lot of new friends in these classes, in my German classes, and I got to meet a lot of the department people, lecturers, professors, and whatnot. And they were such fascinating people, and I told myself that I really wanted to study with them, and so I really wanted to get good at German, and also just something about German kind of clicked in my brain. Maybe it's because it's a Germanic language, and French isn't, maybe because it's more different from English, but also more similar. Yeah.
So it's really a combination of motivation,
yes,
context.
It is a nexus of factors.
Okay. Well, speaking of motivation, and you said, when you started learning French, you were self-motivated. What is, in your view, the source of this interest in language study, and why are you taking these different languages, and why do you think you like doing this?
When I was younger, I remember being at this event that my school put on called French is Fun Night, and it was what the French teachers would put on, and we would all go, and they would have a French theme. So it would be things like Mardi Gras, or cities in France, or the regions of France, the département. And I remember being there, and I noticed one of the French teachers speaking with a student, and it just blew my mind that you could do that. You could speak to someone in a different language. And I was just like, what? That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so I was so fascinated with that. And now I think that's kind of developed into a want to like communicate with more people in different ways. I have a lot of, like I said, I've made so many amazing friends because of German, either when I started and that's what kept me going, or throughout the whole process.
It's interesting, and this is kind of an aside really, but when you go to college, there are so many different things you can do. You can do extracurricular activities, you can play sports, you can join a club. But I think a lot of students get a sense of belonging from their classes,
Right.
from their academic pursuits. And it seems like for you, taking German especially has given you a kind of social network in a way.
Yes. That's not to say that I have no friends in my French classes. I very much do, and they're all very wonderful. But French had been a part of my life for so long that it wasn't something totally new, where German was something totally new, and it kind of represented a new chapter of my life. Moving to college is a going to college. It's like the first step into adulthood. It's a very big change in life. And I think learning German was a good way to kind of find my footing, and it also kind of represented that change in a very positive light.
Yeah, and to signal that change, I guess.
Yeah.
So you're kind of famous among the language lecturers as being, one, a really good language student, but also taking so many different language classes. And so I want to ask you a couple of questions based on that premise. When you tell your friends that you're taking so many different languages and that you're studying French and Francophone studies as well as German literature and cultural history, how do they react? Is it like, oh, that's really cool? Or is it like, why are you doing this? How does it resonate?
It's typically, wow, that's so cool. And then the follow-up, so what do you want to do with that?
Yeah.
And it's very, I mean, I'm sure most of them don't mean it, but in this very like unintentional cutting remark, because it is not a very clear career path. Like, you do finance, you work at Goldman Sachs; you do chemistry, you work at Bayer, or you do engineering, you work at a number of engineering firms. And this is also the case, I feel like, for a lot of humanities based things. The path forward is not so clear. They're always very interested in it, and because I've never met someone with the same like double language major. Well, that's not that I can remember. Not my languages specifically.
Yeah.
It's very unusual. It's just very surprising, I think, to a lot of people. But people are very encouraging when they hear that. Like, that's such an interesting background, and it's definitely an interesting something to give you a leg up in jobs, whatever the job may be, or, and it's not just like, oh, I can speak these languages. It's, I have a great deal of background and knowledge in these languages, the cultural context that I'm familiar with.
Well, it seems to me that you're really going kind of deep into these languages and really getting not just the language, but the culture as well. And, I think there's a tendency within higher education to flatten what people study and really stay a little more at the surface of things. And so I think it's interesting that through your language study, you're going into a greater degree of depth than many people tend to go.
And not just greater degree of depth, but also cross language connectedness, or I don't know how you would phrase that, but I make a lot of, in my classes, German literature, I make a lot of references to French literature, or in French to German, or in Italian to French and German. It surprised me how much they overlap in a lot of ways in kind of greater cultural movements. And
So I want to ask you another question that relates to your status as a person who studies a lot of, or takes a lot of language classes. What are some aspects of language study, what teachers have done in your language classes, that you found really resonating with you, and maybe more generally with people your age? And what have you found that some people do that maybe is not so useful to you, or kind of falls flat, and your peers also kind of feel that way? I think people who are teaching are always wanting to stay relevant for their learners, but they might not necessarily know what is the most relevant to them.
Maybe I'm the odd one out. I love grammar. I find it fascinating, and so I am never bothered by grammar exercises. But I can't say that for the rest of my peers. Most of them find it tedious, and that is understandable. It is tedious to a degree. Things that really work. One thing that I've noticed is, I don't know if you'd call it mixed media kind of language teaching, but using not just, it's not very pedagogically sound to use just a textbook and have people repeat drills over and over. You have to have the language in like real world language usage, but also you can't throw students in to the deep end without like giving them like sufficient context or sufficient preparation for that. So one thing that I found really interesting is the use of something like, in one of my intermediate German classes, the use of a graphic novel. It was called Die Suche, The Search, and it was about these Holocaust survivors. It's a little dark, but it's, when you study German literature and history, it is inevitable. But it's about these Holocaust survivors recounting, their tales of escape and survival in a graphic novel aimed at a adolescent population, early adolescent, 10 to or 11 to 14 about. And it was such a fascinating read because the use of pictures and words simultaneously did such a wonderful job of helping make cognitive connections, of visualizing the language and how it can be used, but also using abstract concepts of like feelings and greater political movements. And I found that it was just so fascinating, and it worked so well. And it was a really enjoyable read. I do recommend it. And it was interesting that it was for young adolescents, and we are, although we're college students from 18 upwards, linguistically we don't have the capabilities of a 20-year-old German student. We haven't lived as Germans for 20 years. So I found that to be really useful.
Yeah, so a multimodal text like that.
It's a multimodal text.
Sort of help bridge, even though maybe you might think at the intermediate level it'd be too difficult. Maybe there was a kind of motivation to read it, and the way that emotions and ideas were conveyed in different, in picture and in text, that kind of was a scaffold for your engagement with that.
Another thing in a similar vein, children's shows. Those work fabulously. They're wonderful. I just was talking to someone today about how watching children's shows in a target language, and then there's research on this, is great because depending on your level, it is teaching native speakers how to entertain, but also how to become more comfortable in the language. And that's just such a fantastic way to meet people cognitively at where they're at.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of on the same topic, one of the things that you told me about, because you work here in the Language Resource Center and we're chatting from time to time, is a class that you're currently taking on the topic of asylum. And this is really an upper level French class. And it is a class that is one thing that we're always trying to encourage instructors to do, which is to get out of the physical classroom and move into the city, move into the different spaces where languages might be used. So can you talk a little bit about this class, your reasons for taking it, what you're doing in the class, and just generally what it's like?
So the class is called Asylum/Asylum, Theory and Practice of Asylum Law through Francophone African Asylum Claims in New York. And so the goal of the class is kind of two or threefold. It is to teach you what is asylum law, this kind of, which you would think is, giving a passing thought, you're like, oh, it's something about fleeing and becoming an immigrant. But it's really this weirdly nebulous concept that is quite different from becoming a refugee. The difference being that refugees have preordained status, like you are granted refugee status by the country before you flee, and then asylum or asylees having to request it after arriving at the country, it being kind of a retroactive action, a defensive action. It's not actually under the judicial branch of the government, it's under the executive branch. So it's this quasi-judicial executive hybrid monster. And so you learn the kind of philosophical basis behind it, how it relates to the rise of the nation state. And then that's the one aspect of the class, is kind of asylum and how asylum law functions in the United States today. And it is one thing I will say is it is very interesting how changes occur so quickly, especially with changing presidential administrations. Something that we talked about in the class changed while we were in the class. So a very current, that kind of aspect. And then you learn kind of the social, cultural, political context of the West African nations of Guinea and Mauritania, because the ultimate goal of the class is to help clients with this organization in New York City write their declarations, which they read in court, that explain their story of why they are seeking asylum in the US. And so we work with this organization, and we are assigned one client for every 3 people, and we work together to look at both their asylum application. There's a form called the I-589, which is governmental form where you fill out why are you seeking asylum. It's actually not terribly long, but it's not a fun read. And we use that and through interviews with our clients to construct a narrative, like their personal narrative on their journey from why are they fleeing their country, how did they get to the U.S., and why do they need to stay in the U.S.
So just to understand a little bit more, there's, I guess, a classroom component to the class, and that's taught by...
So it is taught by, for this class right now, it's taught by the chair of the French department, Emmanuelle Sada. She is a sociologist and a cultural sociologist, so she does a lot of work with Northern Africa, but also West Africa. And she did the section of the class on the social, political, cultural context in the West African countries. And then the other section of the class is taught by a lawyer, a former student of hers. His name is Andrew Heinrich. And he runs an organization in New York City called Project Rousseau, where they offer help for a multitude of different reasons, to mainly focusing on kids, on educating immigrant children, but also on helping provide legal work to asylum seekers to help them apply for asylum.
And so this applied component of the class, does it take place on Columbia's campus, or do you have to go somewhere?
It does take place on Columbia's campus. We had set meeting times with our clients. We were assigned a client. We met them first in a very informal meeting at the Maison Française. And then we had an official meeting. This is what we're going to do. Please recount to us your story. And we have voice recording and we're taking notes. And we meet a couple of times. We just had our last meeting where we presented the finished declaration to them for them to look over and make any corrections that they needed to. So we're not going out. But I will say that this class inspired me to take up an offer from one of my friends who I met through German, to volunteer with this organization, a different one called Afrikana, to help provide interpreting service to Francophone clients from West Africa, typically Senegal or Guinea, to help them apply for asylum. And so this is what we do before what we did in class. In the class, the asylum application is filled out, it's filed with the court, they have a court date, and we have to help them write their narrative that tells their story. Whereas with my work with Afrikana, we are literally filling out the I-589 application. And it's oftentimes working from the ground up. It's taking the basic immigration documents they have, if they prepared a written statement, if they have one. Sometimes they're not literate because they're from very rural parts. And so sometimes it's interpreting long stories, and oftentimes they go through these very traumatic events, and they have to kind of try and tell us what they went through, and it's sometimes not super clear. So I work not only interpreting between French and English, but also filling out the application itself, figuring out problems. And it's also it's very interesting, and it's a very satisfying thing to do. That thing is that we do go out into New York City. There's a different place in Harlem that we go to, and we help them, and you meet all of the clients there.
It seems to me that in both of these activities, both with the asylum class, but also in the volunteering that you're doing, working with people who are seeking asylum and seeking to establish themselves in New York, that these are high stakes situations.
Yes.
Your typical university language learning experience is a low stakes situation. I mean, maybe it's high stakes for a person wanting a good grade,
I need that A.
but ultimately, it doesn't really affect people's lives if what you do with the language in the classroom. But this really, it seems, has a major impact on the lives of actual people.
I've said this about the class before, and I'll say it again. It's a very humbling experience. You have to find this balance between being a human being having emotions, having sympathy and empathy, and being able to interact with these people in a personable manner. But also, you have to keep a distance because you cannot become fully involved in the stories, because then you will not be able to function as like a driving force. You can't do the work that needs to be done, where you need to, help them fight for their lives and the ability to stay alive. Part of what seeking asylum does, the requirement of seeking asylum is that you would face torture or death or something of that matter if you return to your home country, and that it is inescapable. And it's actually extremely difficult to claim asylum, to be awarded asylum, because they try at every turn to point out reasons like, oh, why didn't you stay in Senegal when you fled Guinea? Or why didn't you stay in Nicaragua? And you have to prove, well, I don't feel safe in Senegal because of its proximity to Guinea and the presence of the Guinean forces of order. Or I don't feel safe as a African hijabi woman in Nicaragua. Oftentimes in South America, they will face horrible discrimination because of religion. Most of them are Muslim, or skin color in South and Central America. So they have to prove at every turn why they deserve it and why should they be allowed to stay in the U.S.
Yeah. And you're a part of that as a volunteer or as a member of this class.
Yes.
And so it kind of points out that a path of language learning can, you learn grammar, you learn to read literature, you read graphic novels, but it also takes you into places that are quite a distance from that. It puts you into these ethical situations. It causes you to engage with people in ways that you might not have expected that you would engage with them. So I guess the final question that I have for you is, as you think about the different places you've already gone with language learning and where you might potentially go in the future, what are some things that you 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that you think you might do, and how might your experience of having learned languages be a part of that?
Where will you be in 5? I feel like I'm at a job interview. Well, this has really been this experience of, learning about asylum and helping asylum seekers. It's really been an eye-opening experience as to some of the things that you might not immediately think of when you decide to study a language at post-secondary education. For me personally, I've considered in the future similar work. Of course, there are differing levels of schooling one has to do to be, do you want to be an attorney? That takes law school. I've considered it. I don't know if at my current life, my state in life, I'm really ready for that. But I would my goal, no matter what I choose to do, is to help other people, whether that be through something like seeking asylum or immigrant law or immigration reform, or through exposing people to the great wide world out there. I think Americans, and especially now, we see with the recent changes, recent election, there's a shift towards isolationism. But the world is so interconnected now, more than it's ever been. And so I want to be able to help people open their eyes to that, to have new experiences, just to meet new people, because I think a lot of the world's problems could be maybe not solved, but mitigated if people met more people. And that's what language is about, is communicating with people, meeting them, forming bonds, being what it means to be human, a social animal.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.